Today we will be discussing ships of the Viking Age, and we will be doing this in a few ways. First, we're going to talk about the types of ships that were relevant to combat and exploration. There were other types of ships, but this is the focus of the class. We're going to look at ships both from the literary sources as well as from extant sources. So I guess we should start by saying, how do we know what types of ships there were? And the easy thing is, it's the law. We have actual literary sources. The earliest one, extant source, is from roughly 1250, but the various things, the governing assemblies of the Scandinavian world told us what they were. So Gulating law defines the length and the number of rowing positions from the various ships. In some of the sources, these are called rooms. For the sake of the class, we're just going to call them benches. A bench would have had an oar, one on each side. So we'll call it one bench for 2 oars or a pair. The thing was convened in from roughly 900 to 1300, and an extant copy is available in the Danish Royal Library if you really want to go down that rabbit hole. In one of Snorri's sagas, in Snekja, it does recount that Håkon the Good was involved in the establishment of the thing in the 10th century. And Icelandic's Althing and Locting, which I believe is from the Faroe Islands, also define ships by type, length, and the number of oars. Now you may wonder why this is so important. In a modern aspect, we would say it's so that they can tax us. Bigger ship, more taxes. However, in that time period, it is more likely that this would have been so that we could, the different areas would have put these ships out in defense of a nation. So by knowing how big a ship you have to have, how many oars, how many warriors, you would know your responsibility as a landholder. So moving on, types of ships relevant to combat and exploration. Again, more from a very small saga. And this is just showing an excerpt showing that King Håkon was instrumental in creating the Glothing's law. So with that law, we go to what types of ships are relevant when we get to military applications. First, we're going to start with the Gnar or the Nor. It is a little bit difficult depending on the source you read. They change how it is spelled. So I will just go with what I can actually pronounce because umlauts are hard. So the Gnar is an open sea trading vessel. It would have had roughly 16 meters long, and it has a wider and deeper than you would get in a purely military vessel. This becomes important because you can, the wider you are, the deeper you are, the further out into the waterway you have to be. These military vessels had a very short draft, which means they got to be closer to the shore. And if you actually work it right, you can ramp onto the shore and go directly into combat. So this becomes important in military application. But a Mar would have had 6 to 8 benches, and it would have been used by traders from the Mediterranean all the way to Greenland. Could be used for raiding, but generally they started with the next type of vessel. And we see this very frequently, well, more frequently than not, in inhumation graves. So a Carvey is how I will pronounce it. But a carve or a carfy, depending on your source, would have been what we recognize as a Yarls vessel. This would have been the local landholder that had power. It would have been similar to a Gnar, but slightly longer at up to 23 meters and as much as 5 meters wide. It would have had from 6 to 16 benches and allows for multiple uses. Now the Osberg and the Gox Dodge ships are considered examples of carving, and we'll see examples of this further in. This is the Osberg ship as it was excavated in 1904. So when we get to archaeology, you get an end product that is not anywhere near what we started with. Most of our inhumations with high status graves are of this type, and one or more of these would carry a warband or a trading group. All right, so again, the Osberg ship was an example of a Carvey, and you can see in this the clacker built with the overlapping planks. Most of these were out of oak because it was much more prevalent at the time. It was a good wood for it. You didn't have to worry as much about seepage and other issues that just aren't covered in this class. So we have the Gox Dodge ship, which again, here's the on the left, you see what it looked like in the ground, and on the right, you are looking at the museum display now. So you can see the decking on it, and frequently we get this decking when you have a deeper draft. So again, on a purely military vessel, the decking that you see would not have gone fore to aft. It would have just been in the fore or the aft or both. All right, moving right along. A Snekja or a Snekja would have been your next type. At roughly 17 meters long and 2.5 meters wide, it only had a 0.5 meter draft. That means below the waterline, there's only 1.5 feet of ship. You could get very close to a shore with this or even ramp up onto it. This is the first truly military vessel. It's the only application for something of this sort. It normally had a crew of 41. You can see on this 20 pairs of oars. And then on the end, you would have had one coxswain. And here you can see it did not have a traditional rudder. It had one off the side. And His Grace Eichbrander has given us permission to show you what this would have looked like. And next up, we have a scythe. We use the D in English, but it would have been this letter that does not exist in English here on the side. These are the longest ships ever recovered, defined as having 30 plus rowing benches. The longest recovered is 37 meters long, and it was incomplete. They've recreated what it would have been based on the partial archaeology that exists. They have a deeper draft, and 2 of these have been recreated. The first at 30 meters and the second at 35. They crew 70 to 80, allowing for additional personnel not directly involved in the rowing. And when we get a little further in, there is a possibility for more, but this is just what we have extant examples of. Roskilde 2, the Sea Stallion, which you see pictured here, is the recreation of the scythe. All right. Hjalmar, this is the first time we have questions, or is there anything you want to float to us?
All right. I do not see any in the chat currently. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Historically, to what degree were the ships ballast?
There would not have been ballast, or at least they have not recovered ballast on these. Again, you're looking at maybe a dozen extant versions, but the ones recovered on the sea floor did not have ballast in them. You're looking at a clinker built, so there would have been small air bubbles underneath, but this is the narrower ones really were made to push. They had both rowing positions and a sail, but they were balanced by where you sat in the boat. If you put too much on the right, you tilt it to the right.
Okay.
Question. You have talked about the various ships being used for purposes, different purposes, depending on the depth of the ship. Was the ship ever used, the same one used for multiple ones? I mean, could the one with the deep draft also be used militarily, or could the military one be used for trade, that type of thing?
That's a yes and no question. Most of the ships that we show were in the earlier time period were used for both directions. But once you get to the ones that are purely militarily, they would have been as part of a king's host. So you get different purposes. There are a couple of the ships that probably would have been in a fleet that would have had livestock or camp followers, but would not have been directly involved in confrontations on sea. All right.
So, who was the question here? Who was doing most of the rowing? Were they slaves or soldiers or?
It was the people crewing the ship. They didn't use thralls for rowing. If you think about it, you have 40 guys rowing together for days or weeks on end, and when they hit the shore, they are used to working together as a unit. So when you think about in the earlier periods, the Roman and the Greek times, they were entirely rowed by slaves, not by the warriors. They wanted the warriors to be fresh and to be entirely fighting. And because those were multi-decked vessels, they could do that. This is an open type of vessel where there is no second deck to put slaves, basically.
So they were
Okay.
mostly freemen.
Yes, all freemen. Maybe on the way home you would have a thrall row, but on the way to your raid or to your conquest, it would have been the warriors themselves. So those are the types of ships that we have actual physical evidence for. However, literary sources show us a different type of vessel. Again, purely military. This would have been called a Drekar or a Dreki. These are the ones that we think of as the big dragon-proud ships that were the ships of kings. These were large military ships, and no extant version of this has been found. Now, we get these a lot from late literary sources, and they may be purely entertainment. However, there are enough of them that it is probable that these became the military vessels in the later periods. The 13th century Gongu Rolf Saga discusses the Drekar ships. Again, they had a minimum of 30 rowing benches, and are only recorded from military sources. Sagas describe these ships as unusual, elegant, ornate, and used for raiding and plundering. Several sources for this. Again, Grimskringla says that Harold Farrer in 995 had one built at the Darrow Cliffs, and he called his Trana. Olaf Tryggvason in 998 had both Long Serpent, Ormond Langi, and a shorter vessel, also built in Trondheim, 34 benches, but these had a crew of 200 plus warriors. So in this case, since you only have enough for realistically 68 warriors on oars, the rest would have been in the fore and aft on planked areas where they could actually fight. And we will get to that towards the end on how we think they fought. There is a Faroese-based source that was written in the 13th century, and Olav Haraldsson would have had the Sunden, the ox. Haakon IV in 1262 and 3 had one built, the Ragan, built at Christeden, would had 37 benches. And I'm going to see if I can make this tool work here. Over here on the left, you see the city seal of Bergen. It was created in 1299 that shows one of these that has the dragon prow on the front and the rear. So again, from literary sources, we have other examples of the sea. And Anglo-Saxon Chronicles report in 793 the first instance of what the Western world is called Viking depredation on God's church. And January 8th, the ravaging heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. This is the first recorded raid by Scandinavian forces, although they are likely to have occurred prior to that and just weren't recorded. It makes it very clear that heathen men came out of nowhere to raid the monastic community in the North Sea. Now seems like here we go. Now seems like a good time to talk about the difference between history and literature. That last one was literature. We have the source, but it was written by, the monks who were the victims of this. History tells us that the sagas were all tales, fantasy to pass the hours around fire, teaching morals and binding the culture together. We can and should start with literary sources, but simply take them as a starting point and use the evidence to back this up or disprove later. Which brings us to our next point, proof. From the silver coin found in Maine to male sections found in northern Greenland. We have 3,200 extant runestones that can be proven to be real. And then we have the Kensington runestone from Minnesota, which will forever be doubted. Much of this points to Vinland, but it is still just considered a tale until the 1960s. In 1961, Anstein Ingstad discovered the Viking settlement pictured here at Lance on Meadows. It had multiple buildings, including a smithy. There were organic finds as well as metal finds throughout, including a chestnut, which does not grow at such a high area and doesn't grow anywhere near the site, which further show evidence of the North exploration much further south. Now, we knew about this from the Greenlander sagas. It discussed the sagas, discussed how Leif Erikson and his friends had made their journey. There are references in the sagas to stories that no longer exist. And I'd like to point out here, the Catholic Church spent a millennia destroying written sources, shrines, temples, stones, and monuments that were counter to their beliefs. This was common to all cultures throughout the area, and I'm not judging what they did. I'm simply mentioning that this practice has left us guessing on many things, reaching conclusions based on our modern interpretations that may not even be remotely accurate. But the sagas of Greenlander, the authors did discuss the Lance O'Meadows find, and we believe that it was a stopping point. They had the blacksmith shows that they were making nails to repair their ships. So we know it was there for several years, somewhere between 3 and 10 years based on the find. But again, that's open to interpretation because you can only get so much out of a 1,000-year-old buried site. But the Sagas of Greenlander did say that they were going to set out in a ship large enough to carry 65 men and women, the livestock, and enough to settle in this new area. And that, for a single ship, is outside the bounds of any of the extant ones that we have recovered. Other sources we have, we of course have the Bayeux Tapestry, which shows livestock. It was very common in these raids for the Scandinavians to take their horses with them, ride the horses in fast to make a lightning raid, and then dismount in order to fight. But they had to get their horses with them, so it is likely that either they had a different type of ship or they just took what they already had, put it on Gnars, and those went with the ships. And again, we can see what this Gnar would have looked like. It had a deck fore and aft where you could basically separate yourself from the livestock. In this case, you have fore and aft decking that allowed for separate storage and living areas for the crew. Not all ships would have had this decking. It is theorized that your car would have had them to allow for more than just rowing areas and to allow archers and other warriors to stage and fight in sea battles. We know that something like this also allowed for raids where the various Scandinavians brought their horses with them, allowing for quick strikes. And moving along, we are back to Heimskringla. In chapter 88, we talk about Olaf Tryggsbason, who had an enormous ship built under the cliffs of Lathyr. And I am not going to read this word for word, just point out a few things for you. These were large vessels. It wasn't just a single shipbuilder, but more a master crafter directing others. So we have others who were engaged in building, some in fitting timbers, some in shaping, riveting, and transporting. And of course, you had to create the rivets, so you'll also have smiths involved in this. And again, this shows that according to the literary source, they would have had a dry dock to make it, and then they would have launched. And they are showing that they've never had a ship as large or as handsome. Again, this is showing us a Drakkar. Now, larger ships allowed for large numbers of warriors, their horses, supplies, and in some cases, camp followers to raid and conquer. At the Battle of Hastings, it's reported that 10,000 men landed from only 200 ships. And you're looking at much larger number than would have been rowed. And there is theory that in some of these larger ships, you could have had 2 people on each oar rather than 1 on each side. So again, you've now quadrupled rather than doubled the number of people on an oar, but we still are not anywhere close to 10,000 men with 200 ships. The 37-meter ship had 34 sets of oars. This was the one dredged from Roskilde Harbor and renamed as number 6. But again, much larger vessels had to have been made in order to get such large numbers of men and women to the battles. And again, this is talking about Long Serpent, which is believed to have been the largest drakkar built. And they have 34 compartments, as in 34 rowing benches, and the head and tail all in gilt. We will come back to that later on as a way to date the ships. So while we're looking at this, this is the Viking World was a set of books that was redone a few years back and actually added this slide. This lets us see the different sizes of the ships and, more importantly, the outlines. So down here we have the Gnars. These were coastal vessels that would have had that fore and aft decking, and then the middle area where you would have been able to get, your livestock. Then we have the first purely military vessel, and it would have been much narrower but longer, allowing us to get more, since you didn't have to worry about cargo, more warriors in and closer to shore. Right here, this is the Gox Dodge ship, and Osberg's next to it. You can again see wider. So this is not a purely militaristic vessel, as opposed to Roskilde 2, which is a purely militaristic vessel, long and thin. And you can see the difference here on the drafts. Gox Dodge and Osberg wide had a fairly deep draft, so you would not have been able to get in as close to shore. And here, Roskilde 5 would have been a purely militaristic. This top one here, where you would have had decking, would have been fore and aft, not in the middle. Okay, excellent. All right, back up to questions. Yelmer?
All right, we do have a couple questions in the chat here. First one is, where did the cargo and supplies go?
They would have, so a lot of these benches, they weren't built in. Well, we talk about sea chests, and if you were in the track last 2 hours ago, you would have seen Othen's talk on how to create your own. This is most likely where your own personal belongings and armor would have been, and you would have sat on top of it to row. You would have had, again, front and back, fore and aft. You would have had food, water, maybe a place to sleep. It really depended on the vessel. The recreationists have been able to put up covers to keep themselves out of the weather, and also to take breaks. If the sails were up, you wouldn't have needed to row, but you could have rowed to increase your speed a little bit. And some of these vessels under oars are still going 14 knots on oars and sails, so that's quite a fast vessel. They have rowed from Norway all the way into the St. Lawrence Seaway, so they've proved that it can be done. And they took their own food and water with them. It wasn't supplied to them by the following ships.
All right, the next one is, where did the stories of warriors running across the oars come from?
Hollywood. I have not found an example of this in the sagas. It may be there and I just haven't discovered it, but there is a very famous movie where they did this to show how brave they were. But I think this is just modern fancy.
Excellent. All right, those are the chat questions.
Okay,
Sure.
so Dr. Arndt?
One question. You mentioned the shipyards. Is there any documentation that of whether they ran 12 months a year, whether they specialized in certain kinds of ships?
That's a yes and no. So again, digging into the sagas, it mentioned that it took 2 seasons to complete some of the larger vessels. So the dedicated shipwrights would have been there. When you aren't out, some of the warriors certainly would have participated. I have gotten to take an axe and make some planks, and it is a fairly physical work, so you wouldn't have had just anyone doing it. If you look at the YouTube videos, they are actually building some of these ships by hand, and a crew of 4 is doing all the work. So for smaller vessels, smaller yards, you could have done it at home on your own land, but for these larger shipyards that are doing the king's fleets, I believe that would have been a dedicated, and it seems to be supported by the Saga evidence.
Thank you.
I have a question. You said some
Yes,
of the ships did not come in, were not shallow enough to come up straight onto the shore. So that would mean they would be back from the shore, possibly in deeper water. Could the Vikings swim in that event, or were they always able to get out to the point where they could keep their head above water?
Again, that's kind of a yes and no. By being further back, we're still only talking a couple feet of draft. You're less than a meter, so less than 3 feet of draft. So they're getting fairly close. They are wearing armor. So jumping into the cold North Sea is never a good idea. Doing it wearing armor is going to make your life expectancy shorter. They're not swimming so much as jumping waist high and wading in. All right, so now we're moving from literary sources to extant sources, and this is where academia meets the earth. This picture shows what more than 1,000 years of time turns these ships into, and you're looking at Sutton Hoo, so it's more like 1,400 years in this case. You can actually see the impression of the planks in the sand. There was no wood. This is just the impression the wood left, and if you look really closely, you can see little dots. This is what is left of pieces of metal, and you'll see that better in a couple of the other examples. Frequently, all we get are impressions in the rusty sand, maybe bits of wood with odd pieces of metal or scraps of fabric. In this case, Sutton Hoo, we're looking at a 7th century high status burial between 610 and 635. Now, they were able to determine that based on the coins that were found in the site, and it was in that specific time frame. The ship measured 27 meters long, had 10 to 20 benches, but most likely 14. And this, the analysis on this is most similar to Swedish inhumation graves of the similar time frame. So originally they thought this was someone foreign, or that the individual had grown up in a foreign area, but it's really just unknown. We're speculating based on very little evidence. One of our most famous inhumation graves, Osberg. This was a Carvey dated around 834 by the Denver Chronology. It measures 21.6 meters long, held 15 benches, and again is a high status inhumation. And it has some of the best preserved finds from the Viking Age. The Gox Dodge ship, another Carvey dating at around 850, this time measuring 23.8 meters long and holding 16 benches. So again, these are the Yarls ships. Now, this is one we don't hear very much about, the Tune. This is from the island of Roskilde in Norway. It's dated to 900 roughly, and it is 18.7 meters long, 4.2 meters wide. It had 11 or 12 sets of oars, depending on the interpretation. And this one was excavated in 1867, where they had an entirely different standard for what archaeology was. So a lot of the remains, if it didn't seem important to them, they just tossed it aside. So it is a really neat find, but not one that we can get as much out of. Latvia is a Snekja. So again, a purely militaristic vessel. This one was excavated between 1935 and 1937. And most of the wood was long gone prior to excavation. Again, you can see some of the planking represented in the sand. The ship was theorized based on what is left of more than 2,000 rivets. And that's what those little circles are. That's what's left of just rusty sand, basically. It was 21.5 meters long, 2.75 meters wide, and had a draft of only 0.65 meters. That's about 20 inches depth at midship. It is worth noting that this grave was desecrated probably within a few years of construction. And this is where we have to guess. The body and the grave goods are cut into many tiny pieces. And using our modern interpretive skills, either this is some time of transitional grave between paganism and Christianity, or the grave was desecrated by a rival, or something entirely unrelated, and we just do not know. So if we go here, one more picture of this, and again, you can see this is what they had to go with, and this is it. The ship shows signs of extensive repair. It is estimated to have been built around 900, and based on the grave goods, which includes a link that has the gelling style of engraving on it, and some decorations have been extrapolated purely from the rivet patterns to be in the early part of the 10th century, which again is consistent with being built around 900. All right, so from here on out, we go away from dry land, and now we're going to the seafloor. For the rest of our examples, coffer dams were erected around it, the water was pumped out, and the excavation was carried out more or less on dry land. Now, the narrowest ship ever found, measuring 30.9 meters long, 2.7 meters wide, with a depth of around 1.5 meters, would have had 30 to 31 pairs of oars based on the side planking. Dinner chronology dates the construction at a roughly 985 around Hedeby. This would have been in Hedeby Harbor. Traces of burn damage hint that this ship might have been set ablaze and sent into the enemy, or maybe Gunnar had a bit too much mead and knocked over a lamp. We just don't know. The last 5 sources are all going to be from the same harbor. Now, this is near this town of Roskilde, and it's Skudelov Harbor. There were 6 ships found originally, although they had discovered that 2 of the ships actually were parts of the same one. So while they originally were Roskilde 1 through 6, I believe it was 2 and 4 were merged into the same boat. And then in 1997, they were able to dredge and come up with another ship. The excavation began in 1962. All 6 of the ships were thought to have been sunk to protect from attacks from the sea. So you had a narrow opening where they tried to create basically a wooden reef to prevent the ships from coming in. They were sunk at roughly 1070. All the ships have been dated to the 11th century, and 2 of them have been recreated and are floating at the museum. The first ship, Roskilde 1, is going to be a Gnar, almost 16 meters long, 5 meters wide, would have crewed 6 to 8, and was built in approximately 1030 in Western Norway. So this is in Denmark, and the boat came from Norway. Roskilde 2, and originally 4, this is the one that was in 2 pieces, is a Scythe. So again, a military vessel. It was almost 30 meters long, 3.8 meters wide, and had 30 benches. Now, this one was built in Dublin, Ireland in approximately 1042 based on the Dendro chronology. The recreation of this is called the Sea Stallion, and it is on display. You saw that picture earlier in the presentation. Boat 3 was a Gnar, again, 14 meters long by 4 meters wide, would have had a crew of 4 to 8, so a smaller vessel. It did have plank decking fore and aft, and was the best preserved of all the ships. It was of Danish build, so probably in the area of in about 1040. Ship 5 was a Carvey, so a Yarls vessel, 17.3 meters long, 2.5 meters wide. This one had been built and repaired in Denmark, so there were different types of wood to show the repairs. It had also been created and repaired with recycled and new timber. So again, if you've ever tried to make a plank with a axe, it's a difficult thing. So reusing timber was common. It did have 13 benches, and this one has also been recreated and is on display at the museum. And then the last one, which originally was vessel 6, but has been renamed as 5, was a fishing vessel. 11.2 meters wide, 2.5 meters. I'm sorry, 11.2 meters long, 2.5 meters wide. It did have plank decking added when it was repurposed as a coastal vessel. And then in 1997, we mentioned that an additional ship was found, or maybe 4, depending on the interpretation. That one measured 32, had a keel measuring 32 meters long, and the total vessel length was 36 to 37 meters. So this is as close to an example as we have of a Drakkar, where you have that fore and aft area where they would have been able to fight from. All right, before we get into our last purely interpretive section, we have another place for questions. Hjalmar, did you have anything?
Yes, I do have one. Are there any similarities between ship making and house making?
Somewhat. You're talking about things made from wood with axes. The majority of hand tools that we have would have been multi-purpose, so they would have used the same techniques to make a plank. What you use the plank for differed by the construction, but it would have been the same technique to make the plank. Frequently, they would have taken a large piece of metal, driven it in. You then turn it a little, wedge it, and work your way down until you split the entirety of the board. And in some cases, this is a truly monumental effort. There are one example of a 10-meter long plank that is 37 centimeters wide, which is almost 20 inches. And that is a continuous 33-foot long board that is 20 inches wide. So these men really did have dedication to their craft and true skills.
Sir, question with regard to the changing ownership of ships.
Okay.
Was there a lot of record of ships being bought and sold, and or is there records of ships being captured in military operations?
Captured, yes. Bought and sold, not so much. The Vikings, the various Viking cultures, did not have literacy in the same way we do now. Archaeology finds sticks with runes built into them, but they tend to be non-sequitur. We don't have large volumes like we do in the Western world, where they use paper. So there are not a lot of records of that sort. We do have, again, from the various sagas, instances of ship-to-ship warfare, or just taking what your conquered foe has. So in that sense, yes.
I have a question about the burial practices. You said here that whole ships were buried with burial goods in them, but I had the idea, maybe from Hollywood, that Viking burials were from burning ships at sea. So what was the difference here?
The time period and location. So both of those were possible. Again, burning at sea tends to be what we see in Hollywood, but it is hard to have an example of that because those would have burned and sank into the ocean, and then we just don't know where those goods would be and what would be left after 1,000 years of being at the bottom of the sea. There are inhumation burials where they would have put a human body in a ship, buried the entire ship. There are also inhumations where they made a ship out of rocks, and so you get the same shape, but those were probably more standard people rather than the kings and queens of the day. This is an enormous amount of resources to invest in the afterlife, and the Norse cultures, Scandinavian cultures as a whole, didn't have the same views that we do. So we would not have seen that. Additionally, depending on your time period, you would have seen a transition from burning them to burying them with grave goods to burying them without grave goods. So by the time Christianity became the dominant religion, you now got someone who was thrown into the ground covered in linen and with very little grave goods to their name. So as time progressed, the burial culture changed as well.
We have more questions in chat.
Hjalmar, are there any more questions in the chat? Runa is whispering at me.
I do. I have two. Is Sutton Hoo pre-Viking?
Yes, it is by about 200 years.
Okay. Did most Vikings wear mail shirts or only the wealthy?
Probably only the wealthy. Metal was very expensive, and you are getting a different type of. Oh boy, this is you can teach a class just on this. So we tend to think of that type of mail as flat riveted, where they would have taken either probably a wire, flattened it, bent it, riveted it, flattened it, and that is a ton of effort. If you've ever tried to draw wire, I have no idea how they did it uniformly. It is insanely hard. And that is with modern tools, let alone with without a workshop and a press and progressively smaller holes. It is a ton of work, and I would not have been able to have that as a craft. We did see some mail that has shown up as fragments in Greenland, northern Greenland. So we know that it was more common than we probably think, but it is likely that mail shirts were passed down to an heir or taken off a body of the slain.
Excellent. Those
Are there any other questions? Thank you.
Yep.
I'm getting whispers. Okay, so we're going to go to the last section, and this is purely theoretical. As mentioned before, it's hard to find a buried ship on the seafloor. Let me go to my notes real quick. Many of the images of ship-to-ship combat that we have are derived from movies and TV, or maybe from reading the Iliad and the Odyssey in school. However, the Scandinavians did not fight the same way. There are no examples anywhere or references to metal-clad prows for ramming ships. References we do have are brief, and they say things like 11 ships were taken by 2 in a bay, or King so-and-so fired arrows and threw spears at the Earl's men. It is likely that ships were positioned to get the most frontage on the attacking vessel towards the least of an opponent's. Sagas mention bows and spears being used, so it is likely that ships would try to fight in calm or still water that increased accuracy. In this case, Drakars make much more sense with oars in the middle behind racks of shields. This would have protected the rowers as well as had them immediately available for when a boarding action happened. Ranged fighters would, excuse me. Ranged fighters would have stood on decking fore and aft, and once an opposing ship was somewhat softened up, the decks cleared of men and women. A final few strokes of the oars would have brought them in close enough for an aggressive boarding action. And this one you can think of much more closer to the pirates. We wouldn't have had the rope swinging over, but we probably would have had some type of grappling, throwing ropes over and trying to pull them close together. Again, if you've ever been in the water when it's cold, taking a drink in the North Sea seems like a very bad idea. While an overmatched opponent might try to burn out a larger fleet, it is likely, such has been theorized in the Roskilde, it is likely that ships were taken and repurposed. Most likely, this is conjecture, as the evidence is slim and open to as many theories as our imaginations can dream up. And again, this is where we are purely interpretive. There is no archaeology to back this up. We have small references in most of the sagas. There are a couple longer passages which talk about a particularly important man being killed. But again, how much of that was drama? How much of that was the story? The sagas were written hundreds of years after. The Scandinavians had an oral culture. They had an entire class of people whose job it was to memorize these tales and take them out to the masses. They did not have written texts like we do, and these weren't recorded until roughly the 14th century, sometimes the late 12th to 13th, where, again, people that either were Christians or were trained by the Christians were able to write these down. So it is interpretive and subject to religious oversight as well, because if they didn't like it, they would have burned it. Most of what we have left was hidden in royal libraries and was not discovered for centuries. All right, any comments on that before we get to the very end? Yalmer, any others?
I'm just looking now. I do not see any in the chat.
Okay. Dr. Arndt,
did
do you
we-
have one?
Dottie.
Yeah,
Okay.
did women actually fight on these?
Yes. Again, this would be a topic for its own class, but the Scandinavian cultures gave women the most power and autonomy of any society, probably till the middle to the beginning of the middle of the 20th century. Women could fight, they could own property, they could divorce and maintain their own autonomy. We do see examples in our sagas of women warriors. It was probably not the most popular profession for a woman to have, but there certainly are examples, both in saga and actually in burials of female warriors.
From a naval standpoint, is there any indication or thought on how large the fleets were that engaged with one another?
200 to 300 ships towards the end of the era. Not all of those would have been ship-to-ship combat. That would have been the total size of the invading force. We have several example of fleets invading and conquering large portions of England, and they would have been, again, hundreds of ships. So when you look at the law codes, and this is, again, fairly far down the rabbit hole, when you look at the law codes, each landholder was required to either provide men or a ship crewed by men for the defense of your nation, or in certain laws to go out raiding. So this was a cultural thing to do.
And did the British and other opponents have fleets for them to fight, or was it internal conflicts?
It seems to have mostly been internal conflicts. Originally, this would have started, each landholder was his own little king, he had his own little kingdom, and then slowly as time, these got merged into large kingdoms. Norway, Denmark, Gotland, Sweden, the Finns, they were their own nations. Eventually, Iceland was part of Norway, as was Greenland. And the largest examples that we have in the sagas tend to be one Scandinavian kingdom versus the other, or more likely one king versus the other to unify a kingdom.
Right, and then create a structured peerage.
Yes, and then in later period, 11th, 12th, 13th century, those laws required for the defense of that nation, those landholders, to provide ships and men.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me this morning, or I guess we're now into the afternoon. I do want to have a couple special thanks. The Dragon Herald Elsbeta provided help with the scroll blanks that have been used in the background. These were made by Anastasia Tremaine and Tengwistel Griffith Absinid. And the one you're seeing is the first one, and the other one we've seen, Tengwistel's, was the one I used primarily. I'd like to thank His Grace Eichbrander for allowing us to see his example of what a coxswain was, and I'd like to thank Runa for all the help with the computer things. This is new territory for me. Finally, I'd like to thank Halmer and Honora for being the moderators of this. If you are interested, I do have some links. All the pictures were linked in there, but we have some literary references here as well. Sagas, awesome. Several of the interpretive things we talked about, I used this book for. William Short has actually written quite a nice treatise on Viking Age weapons and warfare, including how to use swords and spears and whatnot with your shield. These are all based, starting with the literature and then using the historical recreationists in Europe to actually find out which of these techniques work. And so if you're interested in historic combat, this is an excellent book. And then finally, if you're interested in Vinland and how Anne Ingstad was spent decades of her life excavating in Lanzo Meadows and then recreating that, this is an excellent book as well. And had some online references. I used the museum sources quite extensively. They were indispensable for the, especially for the boat burials, because they had all the information right there. And that is all I have for you.
You have one more question?
I do have one more question. What's that? Go ahead, Njalmar.
Your Highness, could you share a little info about how you know all of this information and how you got interested in it?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Originally, I had no interest in this. One of the folks in Trotheim had asked me a simple question about how many men would have been on a raid, how many oars there would have been, and where did the ship come from? And that's what started me down this path. So I looked into ships, and I looked, started at the extant ones we have, and then I went out from there and came up with more of a rough outline. I've spent now, oh gosh, probably close to a decade off and on looking into this. It is difficult to find literary sources that are specific. Again, you get a couple sentences here and there on what happened or where they went, but you don't find out what type of ship they used. That is open to interpretation. And I am convinced that there are ships that either have not been found yet for the long voyages and the colonization, or that they used multiple ships and it was just recorded as one, because nobody wants to sleep next to livestock for 3 months. It's just not what you want to do, especially when you have to clean up after that livestock. So everything goes down in a ship and you have no way to escape it. All right, thank you very much.